but a lot of it is very, like we're saying, very subtle and very much just to kind of guide your brain without your brain knowing it's being guided.
And that's like the transitions between the then and the now. It almost always happens so seamlessly.
Yeah.
Sometimes I was watching and a transition would happen. I'd be like, oh, wait a minute.
Yeah.
We're back in.
No. I am the father.
And here we go.
That belongs in a museum.
Are you telling me that you built a time machine? Out of a DeLorean?
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
This is Sparta!
Remember, with great power comes great responsibility.
Dr. Grant, my dear Dr. Sattler, welcome to Jurassic Park.
All right, everyone. Welcome back to Easily Entertained. I'm your host, Bryson, and today we are going to be talking about The Haunting of Hill House. I'm joined by fellow expert entertainment watcher, Cormac Bone.
Hey, that's
How's
me.
it going? Yeah, so I'm living with him over the summer, so expect to see him probably a bit more often on the show. So
Oh, man. I hope so. I love doing this.
yeah, it's great to have you. I'm excited. And so we just watched The Haunting of Hill House. It was my first time watching it, and Cormac has seen it several times.
Many times.
He's introducing me to it. But it's definitely kind of a horror show.
Oh, yeah, certainly. Certainly. Horror, maybe thriller, but certainly horror.
Yeah, it's very suspenseful. It definitely gets your heart beating.
Oh, yeah.
And so I find that super interesting in a show format because I feel like it's harder to make horror go on really long.
Oh, certainly.
And so I thought it was very interesting that they could do a horror show because like Stranger Things has been doing that, or you have like The Walking Dead, which is like generic type horror stuff. But I feel like at a point it gets to drag out really long.
Turns super old. It's overstayed its welcome, that kind of thing.
Exactly. So I feel like this show did it really well, and I think it's because of how subtle everything.
Yeah,
kind of
it really is.
Because I think so. Like the first thing is the main thing about the show is kind of not even based on horror.
Yeah.
It's about processing grief.
Yeah, the human experience.
Exactly. Because at the very beginning, we learn that the mom has died.
Yep.
And then about at the end of the first episode, you realize the sister has died as well. And so you kind of go through it and you're like, oh, so you kind of have to process this grief with the whole family.
With them, yeah. And that's the genius of it because it happens really outside of chronological order. It's not in... I mean, the show itself happens in two different timelines. They call it the then and the now timeline. And it's very interesting because as you watch the show, as you go through it, jumping in time all over the place, I mean, obviously there's a lot of parallels, and that's, certainly on purpose from writing, but it starts to build that grief, that process throughout because you can see you're not exactly seeing it in chronological order. So when you see those little moments when they're kids and then you see it paralleled when they're older, they happen at the same time for you viewing, but for that character, it's like them remembering those things as it pops up. And it's just such a good show. I think everything works perfectly together with that show. Like not a second on screen is wasted. Not a second.
And then I think, especially because you were like mentioning the characters, like the then and the now, the first 5 episodes are all based around the 5 main children.
Right. Yeah. So there's 5 kids.
Because it's Steve, Shirley, she sucks, Theodora, Luke, and Nellie. And Nellie is the sister who dies.
Right. The youngest.
And they're all representations of the different stages of grief.
Yeah, the 5 stages.
Because you have denial as Steve, anger as Shirley, bargaining as Theodora, depression as Luke, and then acceptance as Nellie.
Yeah.
And so because I went into it with you telling me about that.
Right, yeah, I kind of dropped that
on. I kind
on.
of had started to notice it, and I was like, wow, they really are just putting it all in here. Steve is very much a denial type person.
Oh, yeah.
Shirley just gets angry for no reason, and half the time, if she has a reason, it's a bullcrap reason.
Yeah, oh my gosh.
It's like, what? We'll explain that a little bit more. But so... basically, like, the whole story is about all these kids and the family that came from this haunted house, essentially.
Yeah.
And so they have their mother die by suicide after she kind of went a little nuts.
Yeah. The
'cause of all
the house
ghosts.
starts changing her up for sure. Yeah. So like the family, they come into this house, they're trying to flip it. That's the idea. They're house flippers. They have been for, I assume they've flipped a house or two before they get to this one. And, yeah, so the mom like starts to, and that you don't see that till like later in the show, because the first 5 episodes, like we said, follow the kids, and then after episode 5, we start to get a little more of the house and the parents. And so, like you say, it's subtle. It drags. It takes the horror like formula and then like elongates it, but it doesn't make it feel long.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like it's dragging.
Right, which is the mastery that Mike Flanagan, the director, and I think at least partial writer. I know he's a big process for that, but I think it's him and another dude has been writing these shows. But that's like the artistry that he uses to. I mean, he's certainly changed the game. I'd say for writing on the horror scene,
which I think is really hard because horror is not usually the most story-driven genre.
True.
I feel like sometimes they have interesting stories, but they don't flesh them out.
They don't. No, they
much.
don't. They just say, "Oh, here's a cool story. Now let's kill everyone."
Exactly. And so I like that this story is like when you really watch it and you start to think about it more, it's less about the horror side of it, and it is more about that grief side of it. It's processing the loss of a house, the loss of a family member,
of loved ones,
of losing connection with your siblings.
Losing connection, yeah. And like even like when what we're talking about with mom, she starts to lose connection with reality.
Exactly.
And that's like really hard on her, of course. And oh man, it's just so good.
And that's what I love about this series. I was like, I've heard of it, and it's on my list. So I think it's going to be interesting. And then I watch it, and I'm like, man, this is probably one of the greatest shows I've seen because it's
definitely my favorite on Netflix.
Because it definitely takes a story-driven aspect to it. And I think some horror does that for sure. Like, I think more of the psychological stuff tends to be a bit more story-driven, but it's not as common in the horror genre.
Oh, certainly.
I think you can have elements of horror in other things,
right?
But there isn't much where it's the whole show is this horror thriller suspense kind of stuff for the entirety,
right?
And so I like that they made that for this show. I like that the story is there. It's meant to keep you watching it. After every episode, you're like, man, I want to watch the next one. I want to see.
Yeah, it's hard to stop until it's over.
And it's just so interesting. And the characters and the acting are all so well developed that in cases like Cheryl, you kind of love to hate her.
Yeah.
Because Cheryl is anger as the stage of grief. And she gets angry at stupid things.
Yep.
Because she's kind of been put on a pedestal all her life.
Right.
And so she kind of feels like she's above everyone else. And when everyone does something kind of disappointing, she kind of freaks out.
Yeah.
We're like,
and has like she has zero patience, which is one thing that I really hate about some people. Like if you're a person who has zero patience, it's hard for me to talk to you, I guess. We'll put it that way. Because that's something that I value a lot is that patience. And so, like you say, you kind of love to hate Shirley. And she has good moments, but then sometimes those good moments come from her, like, taking the advice of other people.
Yeah.
Oh, man. And you're like, oh, Shirley, come on now.
You're like, oh, I hate them. But I think it is good because you said, like, you can have some moments where you like her. I think that's the case with all the characters.
Oh, certainly.
You can definitely have your points where you're like, man, you guys are idiots. And then you have your other times where these are good characters. They are fleshed out. They have real personalities. They're real people.
Yeah.
It's not just a flat depiction of a character.
Yeah. And I think that's, again, to Flanagan's genius. I've seen some behind the scenes, like, content made for the show, and the actor for Steve, he talks about, like, anytime you had a question, you could go to Mike and he would always have an answer because he loves this show. He knows everything for this show. He knows it front to back. He knows what he wants. I mean, that's just a good director, but him being able to answer every single question instead of having to delegate certain things is pretty amazing, at least if that's what the actor is, perceiving it as. I mean, that's a big thing. And so I think, like you say, they have their own personalities. They're very fleshed out characters. And I think that comes from being more specific and less broad. Because like we say, they all represent a stage of grief. And so having that as obviously it's a preface thing. Like Flanagan wanted that from the beginning. And so he can help answer those questions with that kind of thing. And it helps those characters really find their place. It helps those actors really find their motivation. Like I know you've done some stage performance. I've done some stage performance in like musical theater, which is, superbly different. But like that characterization is very, very similar. And so having that sort of direction really helps your character develop on the actor's side, because they have things to act on and to make decisions based on. And I think sometimes you get that opposite from other directors where they're like, make it as broad as possible. They say, we want you to create your character, just go and do it. And I think for some shows, especially, I think for certain like things like comedy, I think that can work pretty good. But I think for a thing like horror and this is story driven as it is, it makes it really effective to have that very specific driven direction.
And I'm glad that you mentioned like things being broad, because like with comedy, that is definitely the case, because you kind of take an aspect of someone's personality and make it their whole personality. Yeah. But in this, you still want them to feel like people. And so,
because they are going through that grieving process.
Exactly.
We need to relate to all of them, even though,
And so and you would almost think that having each of them represent something means they're only going to be that. Like Cheryl being angry, Theo being bargaining, Steve being denial. You think they would always have that, but they don't. And I think that's really good, because it's taking that thing and not making it broad, because it is what they represent, but you're kind of moving into that subtlety of it. And being like, okay, we can't just make it their whole personality, but this is primarily the direction they go. And so you have to have them still feel all these other stages and feel their normal emotions, while also kids screaming around. But also bringing it around to a normal perspective.
That's those things that they represent exemplifies all their decisions, not encompasses.
Exactly.
I mean, if that makes any sense. Because surely, like you said, there are moments where Steve is angry. I mean, there's moments where all of them are angry, right?
They don't want to fight each other half the time.
Right. But then it's interesting, because when Steve is angry, he's like angry because of denying something. Or when Luke is angry, it's because he was like depressed, right? Because he represents depression. And so, it's that background motivation, not necessarily the upfront, this is obvious.
Because I think other shows, like a big example that I haven't actually watched yet, because I refuse, is the Velma show. Because what I've heard is basically each character is they took an aspect of their personality and blew it out of proportion and just made it encompass every decision rather than be the background to it.
Yeah, I've not watched it either, but I've definitely heard that it's horrendous.
That's something that I really like about this show, is just how subtle everything is. Because you have the subtle themes of grief while like not really throwing it in your face. They kind of make it more of a normal story, which I think, although it's dealing with like paranormal type
certainly
stuff,
some paranormal activity.
I think the way they do it, they fit it into a normal life. You feel like this could be happening with 100%. You and your family.
You're like, oh man, this could have been the house down the street, right? 100%.
And I think it all comes from that subtlety of everything. So you have the subtle themes of grief, because I feel like people kind of process grief a bit more personally rather than sharing it with everybody. And then also with like the horror aspects as well. You don't have big in your face jump scares. The scares aren't obvious. It's more about building tension. It is making you unnerved to be in Hill House. Because it's seeing people just in the background.
Yes. Oh man. Now we could talk about his amazing camera work
Yes.
and sets, and oh man, Mike Flanagan's a true genius. So if for me, when I first watched the show, I didn't start noticing I call it background shenanigans is what I call it. He's so smart. He's dropped little things in the background all throughout the show, but only when you're in the Hill House, only when you're in the then version of Hill House. Because then when you get to the now version of Hill House, it's a little more upfront. The face is easier to see. But in the then version of Hill House, I didn't notice it until episode 7. That's how long it took me to know. And then when I rewatched it, I was like, oh my gosh, there is so much. Literally in the first, like, establishing few shots, you can see a face between the banisters of a staircase. It starts right off the bat. And I haven't really officially looked into this, but I think what it is if you don't see it, your brain sees it. I mean, you're absorbing the whole screen all the time. And so your brain, it's a little bit of that uncanny valley situation where your brain picks up on something, but it doesn't
You're not
necessarily
sure what's wrong.
Right. It's like unconscious observation where those little things in the background start to unsettle you a little bit. And it works so well. And then as you start to notice it and you start like on rewatches and you point it out to people, you're like, oh my gosh, there's a person just chilling there. Like, what the heck? Oh man, it's just, and it's so good. And then into like things like his camera work. Oh my gosh, absolutely impeccable. I mean, there are moments where, again, in some of that behind the scenes content, they talk about where every angle is very much on purpose because, especially with horror, camera angles are very important because you need to know like where a monster might be or where a monster might not be, right? Where an antagonist could be. And if you're showing that on screen or not is very, very important. And it's just, man, every camera angle, every second, like I said, every second on screen has a purpose. And that's truly just, I mean, that's impossible. Well, not impossible, but that's one of the hardest things to do, I think, in filmmaking, where every second counts, every second matters, and you don't feel like any time is wasted.
I'm glad you said every second matters because that really brings you into the monologues
that
all the characters have.
Oh, it's so good.
It is so common throughout the show to have a character be giving a monologue for a while. Like have them just continue on with a full-on monologue. And you can't always have that very well in a show.
Yeah,
and
it's hard to do.
What usually happens, because I noticed this being like a director and like being able to film myself.
Oh yeah.
Monologues don't always continue on the person. It's usually chopped into a lot of different things. This show stays on the person. Yeah. And I like how they did that because that's an intentional choice. Yeah. And it creates that pattern that we like to see. Exactly. And that kind of brings over to the camera as well with like long shots in that one episode where it was like 5 cuts throughout episode throughout the entire show, throughout the entire episode. Episode 6. And it's just a continuous cut for And I mean, obviously they hide little cuts in it, like the first 40 minutes is made to look like one shot. And if I'm remembering correctly, the longest shot in that episode is like 16 or 17 minutes. That's insane. Which is so nuts. It's just the camera goes and then you can't make a mistake or you got to start that shot all the way back from the beginning. Oh, it's so good. It's props to the director. It's props to the actors. It's props to all of them because you have to restart if that goes. And so I think it's these intentional, like subtle choices that you as the audience don't always know at first. Because unless you're like us and you're kind of been behind the scenes of things already. Yeah. You don't exactly notice when these subtle choices are made. And so it's like the audio editor's mantra, like, we do our job good. If you don't notice, we're doing our job. Exactly. He's moved that into the film side of it, into the filming side of it. Because, I mean, some films, they intentionally want you to see where a cut is and that kind of thing. And obviously some moments cuts are very intentional and they like jar you on purpose.
but a lot of it is very like we're saying, very subtle and very much just to kind of guide your brain without your brain knowing it's being guided.
And that's like the transitions between the then and the now. It almost always happens so seamlessly.
Yeah.
Sometimes I was watching and a transition would happen. I'd be like, oh, wait a minute.
Yeah.
We're back in the then. I didn't even realize we had switched times.
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
Transitions are some of my favorite things in this show.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh. It's just like I say, everything's working together. It's truly a beautiful piece of art.
Mm-hmm. And I think with horror, it's harder to do that nowadays. I feel like everything, it's jump scare. It's getting the audience to react.
Right. Which, I mean, those films have their place. But
exactly. But in this one, it's always background. It's subtle. It's building the tension, and it's using jump scares intentionally. If a jump scare happens, there's a reason.
There is a reason
for the jump scare.
Yeah.
Like, I think a really good example that I noticed, I think of the last episode, is when Cheryl and Theo are driving back to the house.
I think it's episode 9.
Mm-hmm. And they're having like an argument.
Yeah.
And
in the car. Yeah.
And then I think it's their mom.
No, it's Nellie.
Nellie. Yeah, it's Nellie that just pops up and screams.
Yeah, interrupts the argument.
And it's horrifying. It
very scary.
You off guard, and it definitely makes you jump.
Yeah.
But it's intentionally done because they're arguing about something that's going to affect the entire family.
Yeah, and Nellie, who, I mean, is a ghost after episode 5, is very much trying to, and we get this at episode 10 in the end, she is very much trying to, help this. I mean, she represents acceptance. So she's helping helping the family accept it. And so she's guiding, from episode 5 on, I've observed where she's guiding people, because in episode 6 she's a very big character, but the interesting thing is, again, like with the camera angles and stuff, you hardly see her. But then, like toward the end of the episode, with the episode 6 has the whole thing is mirrored between the then and now. And then there's a little bit where young Nell is saying, like, I was here the whole time but you couldn't see me, that kind of thing, and it starts to make sense. Like, Nellie's there to so in episode 5, it's revealed that she's the bent neck lady, which has been haunting little Nell for her whole life, basically. Well, since she got to the house, haunting her since she got to the house. And it starts to normalize the bent neck lady, especially after episode 5, because that's where it's revealed. And then in episode 6, it really gets normalized. So we start to kind of see, a creepier image of Nell for sure, but it starts to be a little more familiar. And so as we're guided, and then into, I'm pretty sure it's episode 9 where that scare happens in the car, she interrupts that on purpose, which kicks off, so Shirley and Theo were having a big confrontation because of, like, Shirley's married, and she thought Theo and her husband were, getting down and dirty.
Yeah.
Right? Which was not the case. But Nellie interrupts that argument so that it kicks off a really amazing monologue for Theo to apologize to Shirley, but also explain to Shirley. And which, like we said, she just won't accept explanations.
She's just angry.
She's just
blinded
angry.
by rage.
Jumps
just
into the anger.
red.
Yeah. And so we finally get the moment because Nellie interrupts Shirley, and Shirley finally sees something, right? And it kind of is like, whoa, and like interrupts her character for a minute. And Theo says, you had to have seen that, because before that, Theo's starting to see things and starting to believe, which in the now timeline is a very big thing, where these older versions of the kids need to believe what's happened to them. And so Theo started to believe a little bit already, and so now they can finally get that conversation, which we've been like just dying. We're like, Shirley, you don't get it. And she's like, blood money. Ugh, man. Shirley.
I like that you mentioned, like, them now realizing that ghosts and everything are real, because typically what happens a lot in horror, I think it's kind of a trope, but I like that they use it intentionally again in this show, is that kids will see things. But people chalk it up to being like, oh, it's just their imagination getting the best of them. And I'm like, no, the kids are seeing a demon. You should listen to the child.
Freaking real.
And then the adults start seeing it, and then they realize. But I like that in this, they have experience in both aspects. And it's kind of going back to like denial and everything. They're like, I don't want to believe this.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, I've kind of seen it, but I don't want to think it's real.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of pushing that to the side, and then they kind of have to come back to terms with it, which I think kind of is where Nellie comes in, since she is embodying acceptance.
Yeah.
They kind of all have to follow Nellie. She is guiding them, being like, hey, accept this.
Yeah.
This is what we dealt with living in that awful house.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you have to go back into that. And then it kind of trips you out because you're starting to be like, well, what is it? Isn't
right.
real.
What's happening in their heads and what isn't? Because some things certainly are happening in their heads, but some are very much real.
Especially when you're talking with the mom.
Oh, yeah.
Because she is just losing it.
Yeah.
Schizophrenia gone wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just because she's going back and forth into what is real and what isn't, and she's being manipulated by Poppy, who's one of the ghosts.
Yep. Yep.
And
Poppy Hill
is just trying to murder him.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's so interesting the way they do it, and they really do. It's all that subtlety. They do everything intentionally in the show.
Yeah. And the consistency with that intention is 100% all the way through.
I think
because some shows will have, those good moments and you're like, oh, I loved that. But with this one, consistent all the way through. It's just so
you could
beautiful.
really take any 10 minutes out of any episode, and you're like, this is brilliant right here.
Amazing.
It's all fantastic. And I think it's definitely all due to Mike Flanagan, and I think it's wonderful. And so
Guy's a genius.
I'm kind of excited to see where he goes next.
Oh, dude.
With it.
Yeah. Well, I'm real excited.
Because his next series that's supposed to come out later this year, I haven't found an official release date.
Yeah, I don't think there is yet.
So it's The Fall of the House of Usher, which is based off an Edgar Allan Poe short story.
The same title.
I mean, genius, because
Edgar
Allan Poe was like
big name in horror.
Is the king of horror, essentially.
One of the grandpappies for sure.
And so I'm excited to see where he takes this show, because you've said some of his other shows are good. Like Midnight Mass is really good, but The Haunting of Bly Manor, although it's good, it's not on the same level as...
It's just not, because it does have a lot of that same artistry with the camera work and stuff, but it's the one that came out right after Hill House, and they're both ghost stories. They're written by the same authors, and then Mike Flanagan adapts it. And so they're going to be compared, and it just can't measure up to Hill House. It is good in its own right, especially by way of Netflix originals. I would highly suggest watching it still. But, I mean, after Hill House, you're going to be a little bit disappointed. That's just how it is. But, yeah, I mean, this next, and then I'm cautiously optimistic, I guess, because this is the format that Mike Flanagan does really well, the limited series. Because he has some movies, and he had sort of, I mean, there was a series that was supposed to be more than one season, one of the continuing series, even longer, like the longest form. And it's called The Midnight Club, and it wasn't received super well. It's just a different formula, which, he does a good job, I would say. And it's a pretty good show in its own right. But again, you're comparing it to his other stuff, and it can't measure up. And I think he's starting to realize that, because this next Edgar Allan Poe story is going to be a limited series, and that's just his bread and butter, man. I mean, he just does it so well. And so, yeah, I mean, it's hard to compare those first two because they're both ghost stories, The Haunting ofs. I mean, they're not universally connected. They're just, both ghost stories.
I know. I was trying to pull it up, on search, and it's 2 seasons of The Haunting of Hill House, and I was like, no, there's
not. Yeah,
because they try and count Bly
Manor,
Manor, and I'm like, it's not the same show.
Totally
it's done by
separate.
the same person, but.
And I can get why people would get that confused, because Flanagan has a tendency to cast the same people.
Yeah,
which is awesome, I think. I mean,
and I think with horror that can be really good.
Yeah,
because I love a lot of actors. Not every actor is suited for horror.
And once you work with a director long enough, you get that sort of chemistry where you can know what they want, even no matter what role you're playing. And one of the biggest examples for me in Hill House, Steve's wife Lee. She's kind of a smaller character, right? I mean, I wouldn't say insignificant, but kind of a smaller character.
She's way more background than most of the other characters.
But in Midnight Mass, she's a huge character.
Okay.
And we like Lee in Hill House. Lee's a very great character in Hill House. And her character in Midnight Mass is Shirley. We hate her character in Midnight Mass. And seeing her, seeing that actor playing both parts, man, they're just so talented. And Yeah, like you say, seeing that range is very interesting because in Hill House, like I said, it's like, oh, Lee. And then in Midnight Mass, I forget the character's name. It's been a minute, but in Midnight Mass, you're like, and then you get some justice and you're like, yes.
You're like, finally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's that kind of stuff where you can bring really good aspects to the horror genre and not make it like The Conjuring. It's like, I love The Conjuring. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah.
I love those movies. I think they're fantastic.
Yeah,
But
yeah, me too.
a lot of movies kind of are just very generic horror.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm like,
you're like, seen it before.
And I'm like, I don't need that. And having it as a series, way different because you have to pace everything.
Yeah.
Which is really good. And then you're not trying to just throw everything in your face.
Yeah.
Because I think that's definitely the issue which comes from horror.
Yeah. Pacing is a big thing. And it's kind of an interesting thing because horror in a limited series, I feel like is probably the least frequent format it takes.
Oh, yeah.
It's either like super long and a really generic formula made for TV, like Supernatural, where you can just do a little thing and then
you have Supernatural, you have The Walking Dead, you have Stranger Things.
Yep.
It's all like, I love all those shows. They are all pretty generic in terms of their
predictable.
formula.
Yeah, I mean, and it has to be for that kind of length, which is why I think Midnight Club failed because it's that kind of formula, and
it's too formulaic rather than being more unique in its own right.
Yeah. Whereas, and then so you have either that really long form or it's a movie, and they get really predictable too. So this limited series thing is right in a kind of a sweet spot where you can kind of explore it and really build your own story, but then have enough time to tell it. Because I think some horror movies suffer from that, where they don't have enough time to tell it.
Well, you don't want to watch a 3-hour horror movie.
Right. So
it's not going to do well at the box office.
Right, exactly. That's why I'm loving the limited series thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the future of horror is definitely kind of going in a right way.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm hoping we will get more of these small, limited horror series.
Yeah.
Especially because, like, Mike Flanagan's doing them. I would love to see some other people because, like, Stranger Things is coming up on their last season. I would love to see the Duffer Brothers, who are the directors and writers for that. I'd love to see if they could do a really good horror limited series.
Oh man,
I think that could definitely be something that picks up because it's not so in your face horror. It all comes back to that subtlety. We want the stuff that is creepy. It does make us feel scared, but it's not as in your face as all the movies.
We want to be scared for a reason anymore. Because, I mean, original horror is like, if we're talking like Universal Monsters, it was just about being scared. Because, I mean, that was from an era where those sort of things were pretty taboo and didn't ever happen. And so that shock factor is what drove those films. But that's not the case anymore.
And now we see all of that.
The globe is desensitized a little bit.
We're a bit desensitized. And then I feel like something kind of sad is that we have horror in the world
right
now, and
everybody's exposed to that a lot more.
It's common. It's shootings. It's constant violence. It is thrown out. Yes, it's not just for entertainment anymore. It is a in the world
reality
type thing, and I think because of like the internet and everything, it's so noticeable. And so having a show that kind of pulls back and brings everything back to reality and making things subtle and about making you feel scared is way more impactful than it being all up in your face because we're so used to it.
Yeah. I love Flanagan. He's a genius.
It was fantastic.
I will support pretty much anything he makes.
Yeah. It's...
Oh, we forgot to mention a pretty big thing for that next project.
Oh, yes.
Mark Hamill is in the cast, bro.
Yes.
Oh, my gosh. For that Edgar Allan Poe story, the House of Usher.
With range.
Yeah. Oh, are you kidding me? Voice acting, real acting, Star Wars, but now it's not like everybody doesn't just know him for Luke. I mean, oh, man. Mark Hamill. I'm excited.
I love him as, like, the
I cannot
Joker.
wait.
And
yes.
I think, like, because you had mentioned that he's going to be in the new show. And knowing that he plays an insane person as the Joker and does it so well, I'm like, oh yeah,
here we go.
Mark Hamill's gonna do solid in a creepy horror type show.
Right? Yeah. I'm just really excited to see because for me, pretty much I would say every character that I've seen in Flanagan's stuff, that's where I was introduced to them. And so it'll be very, very interesting to see an actor that I've, watched growing up. I mean, he's big, like you said, Star Wars, right? I've watched Mark Hamill and listened to him in many things like regular show all my life. So it'll be interesting to see how he works with Flanagan and see what kind of, with that raw talent
What kind
from
of
the
background
two of them.
happen with Mark Hamill?
Dude, yeah. Oh, man. So good. So good. I can't wait. I cannot wait. I'm expecting for it to come out October this year because, spooky stuff.
That's when most things do come out for the horror genre.
Yeah, especially for Netflix.
It's great. So, because then you're like, ooh, Halloween time.
Spooky
let's go.
time. Let's get spooky.
Yeah, well, that I think is about it for The Haunting of Hill House. So, yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed listening to this episode of Easily Entertained. Thank you, Cormac, for joining me.
Oh, absolutely.
We will definitely have you on some more episodes because it's good to have like a conversation, just like discussion. It's so fun.
Makes it good.
But yeah, I hope you enjoyed listening and we'll see you in the next episode. Peace.
See ya.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Easily Entertained. If you enjoyed, be sure to tune back in Tuesdays at 5 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, where we're available on all podcast platforms. And if you want all the latest updates on all things entertainment, check us out on social media for Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. And until next time, this is Easily Entertained.